As it happens, this month's Time magazine cover story offers crucial insight into what Trump plans to do as it relates to abortion and other key issues if he becomes president. Again, joining me now is the person who conducted that interview, Time staff writer Eric Cortellessa. Eric, it is an essential interview. I'm not just paraphrasing Joe Biden, but it really is the first time we hear Trump talking with any specificity about his policies. I want to start first with abortion, because it seems like Trump has found his line here, which is that it's let the states decide. I have nothing to do with it. Kick it back to the states. As you were interviewing him, did you sense that he was confident in that position, or did it feel like he understood his vulnerability there?
I think Donald Trump understands that this is very delicate terrain for him. He doesn't want to alienate his core base and white evangelical voters who most prize the fact that he was able to install 3 Supreme Court justices who were essential to overturning Roe versus Wade. But he also knows that a majority of Americans support abortion rights for women. And so he's trying to thread a needle by making this a states' rights issue. And, you know, when I asked him, President Trump, would you be comfortable with states prosecuting women who get abortions after the ban? He said, it's irrelevant whether I'm comfortable or not. I don't have to be comfortable. The states are going to decide. When I said, President Trump, what about states monitoring women's pregnancies to know whether they've gotten abortions after the ban? He said they might just do that. He would also say that he would allow for states to have abortion laws in the other side of the direction, too. So President Trump is really staking out this states' rights issue when it comes to abortion. Yeah,
I mean, but you did paint a fairly draconian picture there, that states might monitor women's pregnancies. And by virtue of not opposing that, isn't that sort of a tacit acceptance of that? I mean, I do wonder whether he can get away with that, because Joe Biden certainly does not think that that is a tenable position and has been saying as much on the campaign trail. I think they've made an ad to that effect. I mean, did you get any sense of hesitation on Trump's part when you asked him such a specifically Handmaid's Tale-like end times scenario?
I didn't get any hesitation from Trump at all. I think he's decided that this is where he's going to be politically. And, you know, that is basically the way in which he is going to navigate this issue. Yeah.
You also pressed him repeatedly, I might add, on the subject of immigration, where he has, in the words of a Time magazine, described kind of the imperial presidency. I'll read an excerpt. To carry out a deportation operation designed to remove more than 11 million people from the country, Trump told me he would be willing to build migrant detention camps and deploy the U.S. military both at the border and inland. I mean, you pressed him on the constitutional implications of this. Did you get the sense that he fully has grappled with the law as it stands and the potential, you know, court battle that would ensue if he actually tried to do that?
Well, I think he understands that many of the things he wants to do on abortion will effectively engineer court battles, right? But, you know, President Trump, when I asked him, you know, sir, you say you want to have a massive deportation operation that will remove as many or more than 11 million migrants. How do you plan to do that? His answer was he would rely on the National Guard to conduct this operation inland to find and haul away undocumented migrants. He would be willing to use the military if he felt it was necessary. He's also going to try and induce state and local police departments to participate by tying federal funding to their involvement in the effort. I think President Trump understands he would face lawsuits trying to challenge him, but this is one particular matter where he plans to pursue his agenda with alacrity.
Can I say, though, your sort of rebuttals, or the fact that you kind of you kept taking a bite of the apple, asking him specifically how he'd execute. And it felt like you had done more thinking about the sort of execution of these policies than he necessarily had. I mean, even on the question of tariffs, right? Because Trump loves talking about trade. He agrees that he's floated a 10% tariff on all imports. He agrees that he has floated, I think it's a more than 60% tariff on Chinese imports. But then he's like, it may be more than that. It may be derivative of that. He asserts that tariffs don't cause inflation. Do you sense that he actually understands economic policy? Because it felt like he was very much responding to you, but did not have a sort of proposal that it was clearly outlined even in his own head.
Well, I think that Donald Trump operates on instinct. And I think he has a very specific kind of instinct when it comes to trade. And this is a Trumpian fixation that dates back to the dawn of his political emergence. He thinks that the United States is getting ripped off in trade arrangements. He thinks that, we are on the losing side of trade deficits, specifically with China. And so he thinks of it much more as a business transaction. I think he understands the issue. He may not be steeped in white papers on, the implications of trade policy. He understands that, the vast majority of economists say that tariffs will increase prices because businesses will pass along the cost of the tariff to the consumer. They won't just eat it. But President Trump sees it from a very specific framework of a sort of transactional dynamic of, we're on the losing end of this deal, so we need a better deal.
Yeah, he definitely sees it in black and white fashion. Eric, it is a really important interview to read, especially in a year where we have so few sit-down interviews with either one of these candidates, I might add, and we have not really had any debates. So it's one of the few times we get a window into how this candidate would approach a second term. Time Magazine's Eric Cortellessa, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thanks for having me.